Hello, everybody. Hi there. You can take a seat. John Miller's here. We can begin here. So, hello, everyone. I'm Mark Kamla. I'm provost here at Carnegie Mellon, as most of you know, and was a colleague of Robyn's during over 25 years that we were fortunate to have Robyn on our faculty. I'd like to welcome you and to thank you all for coming. I'd like to especially thank Mary Schaefer, who's with us, Robyn's wife, two of Mary's children, Patrick Schaefer and Carrie Simons, and Robyn's daughter, Jenny. So we are here to share a few memories and to celebrate the extraordinary life of Robyn Mason Dawes, who died this past spring. We have, let me say, a number of individuals who will talk today and say a few words. And I would suggest that as each of us says, and we're done with what we want to say in terms of remarks, we'll step down and the next person can just come up and say who they are and continue. The list of all of the speakers for today is in the handout. So for myself, I must begin by pointing out that Robyn and I had several things in common. We were both head of SDS at one time or another, and thus at one point he was my boss, and at one point I was his boss, and throughout it all, neither of us could work the SDS coffee pot very well, and both of us relied throughout on Carol Donovich to keep us from going aground. Also, we had the same physical trainer, which, given the buff bods involved, I'm sure I didn't even have to actually mention, and you would have guessed it. Robyn was certainly a very, very special person. He impacted so many of us. And in saying this, I'm not speaking only in terms of his great scholarship, but his impact in various ways on us as a friend, as a colleague, as a mentor, and in his own way, even a raconteur of sorts. He certainly had a broad set of talents. He was involved in many things, but he bore them lightly, and you wouldn't necessarily even know of some of them if you didn't look. Like many of us, I think he spent a fair bit of time in his own head, and in Robyn's case, his head was especially big. So there was a lot of room in it for him to go roaming around in. One of his especially endearing traits that perhaps a lot of you can relate to was that if you ran into him, he would start a conversation up with you. Strange thing was that the conversation had sometimes already begun, seemingly between him and himself, before you had arrived on the scene, and you were sort of allowed to join in and try to figure things out as you went along, and it was always worthwhile to do so. I can't obviously do justice to his professional and scholarly research contributions anywhere near as well as many of the others here. He was extremely accomplished and impactful. He was one of SDS's first chaired professors. He was one of our first university professors. In terms of his scholarship, what I think I can say is that there were few things that Robyn liked to do more than to debunk the common wisdom. He held a number of progressive positions, social positions, and often his work, if you thought hard enough about it, was relevant not only scientifically, but had definite direct social implications as well. I can also say that there are few papers that I have read that have had more practical impact on things that I get involved in every day than his paper, The Robust Beauty of the Imperfect Linear Model. And every time we admit a student or hire a colleague or many other things of that sort, I always remember what poor Bayesians we tend to be and how much we over-attribute to our impressions from short interviews compared to records that have compiled over decades. I very much think of Robyn's work. One thing I certainly think of when thinking of Robyn and SDS is how lucky we all were that he was at CMU and at SDS for a long part of his career. He fit in here very well. He lended enormous prestige and legitimacy to SDS when it was starting out by him being here. And indeed, it was under his headship and his influence that we added the D to our name, not for Dawes, but for decision, as we changed from social sciences to social and decision sciences. He fit in very well here. I hope it is also a fair statement that Robyn felt that he was very lucky to have landed at this institution. I think we fit him very well also. Thank you very much.
I'm George Loewenstein, professor of economics and psychology in the department. I was there, or I have been here, I'm still here, for 21 years, I think. So I knew Robyn for a really long time. And since I started thinking about what I was going to say today, I actually started having some dreams about Robyn. And in these dreams, he has been consistently funny in these dreams. And Robyn, in fact, did have a remarkable sense of humor. He had a very kind of wry, caustic sense of humor. If you look at the back of the program, that really captures the Robyn of my dreams. But I always suspected that the humor was, in part, an attempt to deal with his other side, which was a much more gloomy side. If you looked at Robyn walking around the halls, he was kind of hunched over as if he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. And if you talked to him or read his work, it was obvious why. Because Robyn almost couldn't endure the cruelty and stupidity and irrationality of the world. He studied cruelty, lack of cooperation, and irrationality, probably because these things drove him absolutely crazy. In fact, Robyn believed that there was an inextricable link between irrationality and cruelty and inhumanity. He believed, he had a kind of idiosyncratic view, an unusual view, that inhumanity is due to irrationality. And he actually argued very explicitly against the view that I myself have espoused, that emotions play a big role in irrationality. He argued explicitly against that. He said the source of cruelty is irrationality. If you could get rid of the irrationality, you could get rid of the cruelty. And he specifically defined irrationality in very cognitive terms. That is, either holding different beliefs that were contradictory to one another, or holding beliefs that were contradictory to one's behavior, that conflicted with one's behavior. It's no mystery why Robyn saw a lot of cruelty in the world. If you open the newspaper or watch TV, you will understand why he saw that. I think why he saw the world as so irrational in some ways is more interesting. And part of it is, of course, that the world is somewhat irrational. But part of it, again, goes back to Robyn's big head, that he himself, part of the reason that he thought that people were so irrational was that he was so brilliant himself. And there was one incident that really underlined this to me. I encountered Robyn in the hall, and he seemed to be kind of holding his head in pain. And I said, "Robyn, what's going on?" And he said, "Well, I was just teaching, and I was teaching my class the classic anchoring problem. And the classic anchoring problem, you ask people to estimate a number, either 9 times 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 1, or 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5, and so on. And people tend to give a much higher number in the first case than in the second case, because they anchor on the big number, they anchor on the 9, and they don't sufficiently adjust for the other digits. And so I said, well, what's wrong? Did it work? Yeah, it worked. So what's wrong? And he said, I just can't believe it. They gave numbers that didn't end in 0. And so I said, that's terrible. But madly trying to think why, in fact, that was irrational. Later on in my office, I realized there's a 2 and a 5, which multiplied to 10, so of course it has to end in 0. But anyway, I think part of the reason that Robyn thought that the world is so irrational is because he was so smart. So Robyn couldn't stand inconsistency. It really pained him, and he believed that the source of that inconsistency was the source of evil. And in some ways that is ironic, because Robyn himself was a mass of contradiction. And in fact, it was exactly those contradictions that gave Robyn his humanity. And so exactly what he saw as the source of inhumanity is what gave Robyn his own humanity. An example, and this relates to something that Mark was talking about, Robyn had a great belief in actuarial models. That if you wanted to know, like, is somebody going to commit a crime in the future, don't bother talking to the person. Don't bring out a psychiatrist, but look at the person's criminal record. That's enough. Or when it came to job candidates, he always espoused the view that you should simply look at the person's CV. Don't even bother to have them give a job talk, and so on. But if Robyn attended a talk and he was excited by the talk, or if he went to dinner with a candidate and he loved the dinner conversation, the actuarial models had a tendency to fly out the window. And so that's one source of inconsistency. Another source of inconsistency is that Robyn appeared to be completely disorganized and incompetent when it came to technology. And there's a famous story about him that he had taken some galleys for a paper that he's going to publish, and he punched some holes in the galleys, but he punched them on the wrong side. And then he picked up the holes and he tried to glue the holes back into the paper. That's true. Good point. Actually, that relates to my point. I always wondered whether he was deliberately incompetent. In the same way that I shouldn't draw this analogy because my wife is in the audience, but in the same way that you might suspect that how bad I am at doing the laundry might serve a function.
Nobody's perfect.
In any case, he came across as actually quite incompetent, particularly about technology and various other things, but he was an incredibly able administrator. He guided our department very ably for 5 years, and then when we were lacking a department head, he came back and did it again. So once again, a dramatic contradiction. And the third contradiction relates again to something that Mark said, that no one who knew Robyn could have failed to notice this strange thing that you'd encounter him in the hall, and you would be entered into the middle of a conversation that he was having in his head. And so it was often very difficult to understand him. And it took me a while. At first, when I first met him, I was really kind of intimidated by him. After a while, I got more comfortable, and I learned to say, Robyn, I don't understand what you're talking about. And he would generally kind of startle and then step back and explain things. But the contradiction here is the contradiction between your conversation with him and his amazingly clear and lucid and compelling writing. He was an absolutely amazing writer, and this is evident in all of his books. I chose a single passage to read because I thought it was so representative of his writing. It captures the quality of the writing, his somewhat cynical view of the world, and also he was actually quite open about himself. He was quite self-revelatory. All of these things come out in this passage. In my very limited clinical experience in my first 2 years of graduate school, I preferred working with psychotic individuals to working with neurotic ones. We neurotics tend to whine, to feel underappreciated, to be passive-aggressive, and worst of all, to expect our therapists to alleviate our problems. In contrast, psychotics tend to be upfront about their views and beliefs and expectations, and though they might wish to be as manipulative as neurotics, they generally can't pull it off as well. I think it's just a beautiful piece of writing. I never actually noticed Robyn whining, being passive-aggressive, and he didn't seem particularly neurotic to me, but I think it's kind of endearing for him to admit to these traits in print. So the last dimension of inconsistency that I want to draw attention to is maybe the most fundamental. Robyn was what I've called a lamb in wolf's clothing. In fact, it was my encounters with him that kind of led me to come up with this expression. Perhaps because he was so cynical about life, or because he could do analyses of variance in his head and then point out the problems to the ANOVA that you had just presented in a seminar, he came across as somewhat gruff, and students and even some of his junior faculty undoubtedly found him intimidating. I did as well, until I got to know him better, came to appreciate his wry sense of humor, and realized that he liked nothing more than to be goaded and teased. When you did get to know Robyn, however, you discovered that the gruffness was a complete facade. In fact, he was exceptionally sensitive, emotional, not, in my opinion, not particularly neurotic, and a very caring individual. You could see his emotionality in the music that he composed and played, and his humanity was evident in his commitment to social causes and at a more personal level, the way that he nurtured his junior colleagues, which it might be difficult to imagine at this point, but I once was. So anyway, in short, Robyn not only studied human contradiction, but he also embodied them in a particularly delightful way that we are all going to miss.
Hi, I'm Jason Dana, and I was Robyn's graduate student and got my PhD in 2005. And as I was thinking about this and what to say, I never know what to say. I had a lot of memories about how I came to be Robyn's student at CMU. And it's not often that you could say sincerely, right, that your entire career path was inspired by one person. But this is really, like looking back, completely true of Robyn in my case. In the late 90s, I was in a clinical psychology program. I was doing therapy and assessments, and I was on path to be a professional psychologist, nothing academic at all. I'd never heard of anything called research and decision-making or something. I would have no idea what that is. And in one of our assessment classes, we read some of Robyn's research on clinical decision-making, and to say that I was moved would be obvious. I'm here, I'm talking to you. But it moved me not only because it was uncannily accurate. I was like, yes, definitely we do these things. But because most other clinicians were at best ignoring it and at worst reviling it, right? And this I could never get over, right? Because it seemed so obvious to me that what he was saying was absolutely true, and almost nobody that I worked with and was around wanted to hear it, right? And so I had a lot of misgivings about my career path at the time, and at the worst times, during the soul searching, I got a lot of comfort and solace from this man, his writings, who I'd never met. I felt like a kindred spirit. So when I learned that he was in fact in Western PA, that he was at CMU right in Pittsburgh, I said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. Right? I'm going to apply to, I'm going to go take GREs again, and I'm going to apply to decision-making programs. And it was explained to me, because I was at a place called Indiana University of Pennsylvania, that maybe I would be more interested in CMU than vice versa, so, maybe you should have... I don't think anyone ever made that move, so I said, maybe you should apply to a few other places, but I never had any intention of going anywhere else if CMU had taken me, right? This is where I wanted to be. So when I got the call out, for the recruitment, I was really nervous. I had never met or worked with famous academics that you read about, so, and especially with Robyn, because I hoped that he would be my advisor. So when I finally got in to meet with him, sometimes he can mumble a little when he talks. But I didn't want to be like, huh? Can you repeat? So I just shook my head along to whatever he was saying, and he managed to tell this entire joke that I missed some crucial element of. At the end of which he just laughed uproariously, so I laughed with him. Yeah. Oddly enough, many, many months later, after I'd actually come to CMU, I don't know what happened, 2 neurons connected, and I figured out what the joke he had told me was. All the way back then, he was talking about how much depression and alcoholism there used to be in academia. And I guess there was a brand of scotch that was called Grants. So people used to say, oh, I got to get a Grants. This was the... And somehow one day that dawned on me. I was like, oh, that is kind of funny. How about that? So yeah, we were talking about depression and alcoholism during my recruitment visit for graduate school. If you know Robyn, he was not afraid to look into the maw of the void, and he would often invite you to join him. So of course, I wanted to come and sent my email intentions. Yes, I'll come. And I got a one-word response email from Robyn that said GREST, capital Grest. Right. Yeah, that's a typo for great. But at the time, right, I'm thinking, would somebody really send a one-word email with a typo? He's an intelligent, worldly guy, and, GREST is probably some expression of congratulations or something that I'd never heard of. So I say to the dude next to me, another IUP guy, is like, you ever heard of GREST? Robyn Dawes just sent it to me, and I don't know, I want to reply, but I don't know what to do. He said, no, I don't know what that is, but you better find out. So I admit that I spent 5 or 10 minutes convincing myself that there's no such thing as GREST. So, I learned a lot of things from Robyn that blah, blah, blah. Intellectually, they still influence my work. They still influence my career. I could bore you telling you about those, but the thing that sticks with me more, the thing that stuck with me this week when I was thinking about it, is more his example, the way he conducted himself, the way he approached research. Because, like others have said, Robyn didn't jump on citation waves or work on whatever hot topic was in. He took unpopular positions on unique, in unique areas that because he thought what he was saying was true, And he explained this to me one time, his sort of approach or his strategy. And I don't know if this is something that he said generally or something that he just said to me in this talk, because I'd never heard it. But he likened himself to a sea anemone. Right? He said, I just sort of put my stuff out there in the way, and see if it catches anyone, right? And it worked, right? And some people probably got stung, but in general, right? He was not ignored. And I think that's the thing today. I mean, sometimes the research you take on, the trails you try to blaze, other people aren't as initially excited about as you are. And you have periods of self-doubt, and you think, should I give this up and try something else? And, I've come full circle, because again, I don't have Robyn around to talk to. But again, I find myself in the worst times, thinking of him in the example of the anemone, right? And I take a lot of encouragement and strength from thinking of the anemone, right? Stick with it and try hard. So, I don't know, it's weird to memorialize someone as a poisonous, predatory sea flower. But this is Robyn, right? And somehow only for him it seems fitting, right? So, okay.
I am Christina Becher, and I used to be a colleague of Robyn for many years, and we used to teach together. Actually, I think we taught together for almost 15 years. Now, a few days ago, I was, a few days ago, I was preparing a lecture on, in philosophy of social science, on the social construction of social categories. And I was thinking, what sort of example should I give my students? And then let's look at the book Everyday Irrationality. It's a wonderful book that Robyn wrote. And there is a very interesting chapter on sexual abuse hysteria. And so I chose that chapter as a fantastic example of how certain social categories can be constructed. And this chapter is also an example of something else. It's an example of Robyn taking up challenge after challenge when he saw one. And he saw many, believe me. And, in the course of his career, he fought, again, irrationality probably most than anything else. Now, he was, as I used to tell him, you are a rebel with a cause. Without a cause. He was really a rebel. And few knew, now it's written here, but few knew that he was a philosophy student. And I think something of that remained in him. His, passion for, analyzing and being critical about the foundations of what he was doing, be them the foundation of psychology, methodology, was looking at, statistical method, and, of course, behavioral decision theory. Okay. He was a mentor to me and a great friend. Almost as soon as I came here, I was invited to teach with him the graduate seminar in decision science. And, I was a very theoretical person, and I knew basically nothing about experimental work. And I learned so much from him. And actually, to keep up with him, I studied 3 times more because I didn't want to look like an ignorant. And even when we were teaching stuff in social psychology, I remember, even if it was his part, he was teaching that, I would read like crazy 4, 5, 6 articles because I was ashamed to show that I knew nothing. So I learned a lot, really a lot from him. And what was striking, having him not just as a friend, but as a colleague and teaching together, was the enormous curiosity he had. He was almost curious almost about anything. And he would follow this curiosity with an incredible seriousness. He would look into that and read the stuff and be able to discuss it with great competence, even after, he had for a few days, some new topic. He became incredibly competent. So it was pretty amazing, and I felt really small in front of him. He had a critical eye, was very critical, and he was totally willingness to engage in endless debates. And what was interesting, when we were teaching together, very often we disagreed. And, told each other, how can you say that? And the interesting thing is, he was always incredibly respectful. So he would disagree, he would fight for his ideas. Sometimes he recognized I was right, sometimes he thought I was completely wrong, but he had an enormous respect for the other person's viewpoint. And this is what came through with him, so strongly, and was, so good. Even if you were, against him or discussing with him, it made you feel really good. Now, he introduced me, as I said, to social psychology, to behavioral decision theories, and to the Sopranos. But more of this later, okay? So I learned a lot from him in this respect, but I want to tell you about, The Sopranos, because Robyn had a very funny side and, of course, also a very serious side. But most of all, he was an incredibly law-abiding type of guy. If there is a rule, the rule has to be respected. And being Italian, I don't think like that. Rules are here to be broken. So one day we were talking about, flying and international flying, etc., etc. And so, and then I say, and then they give you this ridiculous piece of paper where you have to write, all the stuff that you bought, like a pair of socks. And he looked at me and said, of course, I do that. I say, you're joking. No. He said, I do that. I write, a pair of socks. And I thought he was completely, pulling my leg. And so I kept saying, come on, Robyn. And he said, you don't do that? No, I don't. I wouldn't dream of doing that. And he looked at me curiously, and then he said, do you like The Sopranos? And I said, well, what's The Sopranos? Oh, it's a very interesting, TV series. You should look at that. And so I started looking at The Sopranos and obviously liking it a lot. But what always, made me curious is, does he like The Sopranos from a purely sort of scientific viewpoint, because he's an example of a mafia organization and he's very interested in this stuff? Or there is some sort of fascination he has, for these lawless rule breakers, etc. And maybe he liked me also because, not that I am a soprano type, but, there was something in me, that made him think, who's this person?
My name is Julie Wade, and I worked for Robyn Dawes in the Department of Social and Decision Sciences for 3 full years, from the summer of 2004 to the summer of 2007. And when John invited me to come and talk, I decided that I would take you back to the week that I got hired to work for Robyn. And there are some sort of moments that play out and extend into the rest of the 3 years that I worked for him that started that week. I was a new transplant to Pittsburgh from the West Coast. I was looking for just a simple job, like low responsibility, not a lot of emotional involvement, something very part-time and temporary, something easy. And I registered with Temporary Employment Services, and I said, I'm a grad student, I really need to focus on that, but I need to pay some bills, so could you hook me up with a job? And really just a job. And what I got was Robyn, so it couldn't be just a job. It was going to be an experience. It was fated to be an experience. And I met first, there were 2 preliminary meetings before I got to Robyn Dawes himself, which already seemed very, leading up to something big. First, I met with Pat Schaller in TES, and she was sort of describing the job to me, and I sensed some reticence to say everything, or maybe some inability to say everything about what I was going to encounter in this job. But she told me that there had been some problems with turnover, and that not everybody found it to be an ideal job, but that I would get to work with someone really brilliant and really amazing and really interesting, and that one of my main duties was going to be transcribing little tiny tapes that would be left in my mailbox that would be Robyn's correspondence that he would record, random thoughts that he would record, excerpts from his books, dictation for future books, things that he would record into these tapes, and I was going to listen to them, and I didn't have any prior experience with dictation. But she was explaining that this is how this would work, and they would be left for me, and I would type them up. And I thought, far out, that's very Della Street, it's very anachronistic, I can do this, I'm gonna try it. And so I was intrigued. And then the next step was going to actually get in the door at SDS, and I met with a former business manager, Amy Patterson, who is still a very good friend. I met with her, and her response to setting up the meeting with Robyn, the interview with Robyn, was, it was very cryptic and there was no context, but it was, if, and she may have actually said when, if you quit, just give me the key back. I just want the key back. So slide it under my door, whatever you have to do, but don't leave with the key. And so I was really interested now that I'm going to have tiny tapes and I'm going to want to give the key back. And so I started to think that maybe I should look more fully into this person I was going to meet with and work for, ideally. And so I started Googling Robyn Dawes. And I didn't know anything about social and decision sciences. And I was incredibly daunted by the profile of the man that I was reading about, all of his incredible accomplishments, his yards-long CV, and I started to get really intimidated before I had even met him. And so I was writing notes like mathematical psychology ? And reading book reviews on Amazon of House of Cards and Everyday Rationality and trying to sort of prepare. And I thought, this is going to be the biggest and most important interview of my life, and I'm going to walk in here and I'm going to have to defend why I should be the one to transcribe these tapes and why I should be the one to have this job. And so I was fully prepared, and I spent more time on this than I had for anything else ever in meeting someone for the first time. And so I arrived and I had my little CV in hand, and it was all soggy where I was clutching it, and I walked down that hall toward Robyn's corner office, and I remember that I stopped because I heard this sound, and I thought at the time that it was a vacuum, and so I thought that somebody was vacuuming his office and that I should wait. So I waited, and I got more and more nervous, and then it stopped, but nobody came out. And I thought, okay, well, maybe he vacuums his own office. That's incredible. How humble. He's not expecting anyone else to do this. So I finally knock on the door, and I come in and I sit down, and I'm still holding, sort of clenching my papers, and I get ready to what I think is going to be the moment where I'm going to present this whole case of why I'm going to be so good at this job. And Robyn's first words to me were, "I want you to know I don't believe in interviews. They're inherently irrational." And so I had this whole wonderful, I thought, defense prepared for why I would be such a good dictationist and sort of person of all, personal research, any kind of assistance you needed. And he's telling me that nothing that I can say will be of any use. And so we sort of looked at each other, and then I said, well, what do you want me to do? To commit to me, you don't want to hear my strengths and weaknesses. You don't want to hear about a time I successfully resolved workplace conflict. You don't want to hear about my time management skills. What can I do? And he said, past performance predicts future performance. And I said, okay. And so he said, what do you have that's quantitative? And I said, well, I don't know, because I was a public safety secretary at Chatham University before, and I said my boss gave me a lot of thumbs up when he walked by, and he said that he was really sorry that I was leaving, and of course that was no good. That was all anecdotal and qualitative, and I could have been making it up. So there was no proof there, and so finally we sat there in silence, and then finally he said, "What was your high school GPA?" And so I told him, and then he said, "What was your college GPA?" And I told him. And he said, "What was your GRE scores?" And I told him. And so he sort of thought about it, and he said, "We'll give it a try." So I thought, all right, okay, I passed muster with Robyn Dawes. And so I was rather scared, and I think I did leave my CV at that time, as I recall I did. And a couple of days later, in my mailbox, along with the tiny tapes, was a CD of Robyn's music. And in his sort of incomparable scrawl, he had put, "I'm an artist too." And so there was some sense that he had read or heard about the fact that I was interested in something very different than he was, but that he was already trying to make a connection with me, and he didn't have to do that, right? I mean, he's a scientist, I'm just there to be his assistant, but he wanted to make, through his music, a connection to the fact that I was a writer. And so I listened to the music, and I thought it was very unusual and very interesting. And eventually I got another little Robyn note that said something to the effect that he would be interested in reading my work as well, or sharing in my art as well. And so something that not everybody knows about the 3 years that I was working for Robyn, was that there was this backdrop to our relationship where I listened to his music, and we talked about his music, and he also consistently read everything that I was producing in the MFA program at Pitt. And not only did he read it, but he gave me feedback on it. Sometimes he gave me feedback in the middle of a tape that I was transcribing, and I assume I don't have to type the notes if they're about me. But he consistently read, and so I was struck by how how my first thought of him vacuuming his own office, which was not necessarily the case, but how I inferred that the humming was vacuuming. There was this kind of humility that I was right about, that there was this way that he was really interested in making that kind of connection, and he didn't have to, right? He didn't even have to care, but he was so open and also looking for what we might have in common, he the scientist, me the poet. At first it seemed perhaps like nothing, but then we found that space. And so I guess in closing what I would say is that I've been gone from Pittsburgh for 4 years. I get back to visit sometimes. I got back to see Robyn and Mary last summer in 2010, which was really nice. It was after he retired, and I got to spend some time with them. But since I've left Pittsburgh, I meet a lot of people who are from here, a surprising number, or people who are maybe just interested in the Steelers, but who get really excited when I say that I lived here, and they want to know memories about Pittsburgh, or what was it like to live there, sort of impressions, or what do you miss about it, what did you like about it. And it's eerie because on the back of this program is exactly the first image that comes to my mind when I think of Pittsburgh. I was going to say that before I think of anything else, the first thing that I think of is Robyn, but not just Robyn in some sort of abstract way, but this exact face, the Robyn of the impish grin, the Robyn that was sort of the face that he had when I walked into his office the first time that I met him. And somehow that is Pittsburgh to me. There's a way that Pittsburgh was difficult at first and unfamiliar and unpredictable and ultimately unforgettable, since I'm here again. And those are the same qualities that I found in Robyn. So he is quite unforgettable.
I'm Baruch Fischoff. I moved into an office down the hall from Robyn in 1974 in the Oregon Research Institute on the old Beta House during the down days of the fraternities along the Mill Race in Eugene. And I had offices near Robyn's for most of the ensuing period, and all that time we collaborated on one paper which had 9 authors. It was like the better half of the Department of SDS was in this one paper. And so those of us who knew Robyn, as you see, was such a strong presence. There are echoes of Robyn in all of us. And I've thought in teaching about, well, how do you tell people who, didn't have the Robyn experience, who don't need to figure out what the humming was. For years I thought it was the radiators. That, how do you tell them what it was? So I thought, here's sort of my summary. I've been trying to use things like this in class, and I thought I'd end with some of Robyn words, so forgive the PowerPoints. I thought, these are, I think, the questions that Robyn often asks. He says, when you do research, will it do anybody any good other than the researchers? Can the results surprise us? If we're not producing new science, we ought not to be doing it. We're smart people. We can find other ways to make a living. And then third, will the research participants be treated respectfully, so that the research was always a social relationship, was an expression of our social contract, and that was a social contract he had with the people he worked with, as well as with the subjects, quote unquote, were the people that he worked with. What were the kind of answers that came out of Robyn's research? Perhaps the first and foremost, which echoed the previous, that expertise is more limited than we think and that we wish. And Robyn had particular objection to people asserting themselves into other people's lives, acting as though they knew more than they knew. Second thing, and the work that he did intermittently through his life with John Orbell, Jeannie McTavish, and others, was that in situations where people have the option to collaborate with one another or cheat one another, they found that Robyn believed that the rate of defection often was higher in our experiments because we detached people from the social norms. And he did work showing that if you allowed kind of the normal kind of moralizing that you have in some of everyday life into our experimental context, that people were better people in that way. Third, he didn't believe in judging people too quickly or too harshly. As George has said, much of our stock and trade in this business is finding the errors that people make, and these errors are diagnostic. They tell us something about how people act, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people are flawed in in fundamental ways. And many of Robyn's insights, again, this kind of unintuitive positions that Robyn would take, would come up with ways of understanding behavior that appeared to be wrong as actually having its own kind of logic. And then finally, echoing the first point, is that he believed that deceit produced poor science, that he was strongly against deceit in experiments, and he thought that it was produced poor science in the short run because it created unnatural situations. It produced in the long run because even if you debriefed the participants in your research about the ways in which you had deceived them, that the word got around that psychologists were cheats, and who knew how you were kind of polluting the common of goodwill that all of us researchers depend on. And then, this will sound a lot like what other people said. There were some things that I took away as guiding, Robyn's life, and when we ask ourselves, well, what would Robyn have said? They would have been, to my mind, derivatives of some of these things. That, first of all, that you knew as much as he did. I used to think of it as starting in the second paragraph of a conversation, but that was the second. But however, if you asked Robyn to go back to the beginning of his thought, he was always happy to do it and assume that you could pick up the missing pieces. That he actually believed that you might be, well, perhaps ignorant, but you weren't stupid, that you didn't understand all of these assumptions, but you could grasp them if he gave them to you. So third, that you too cared about the science, more about the science and about personal advancement, so that the research was a way to better us all rather than just to advance your career. Fourth, that you too cared about every study by every scientist. So those who were at our research seminars, it didn't matter how obscure it was. Robyn was on task trying to figure out what people were doing. And then finally, if he didn't think that they were getting it, he always gave people the benefit of the doubt that there was something, that you were onto something in your study, and if he just worked with you, you could bring it out. So the fundamental respect that even flawed work reflected some insight. So several people have mentioned this paper, The Robust Beauty of Improper Linear Models in Decision Making. I just taught it on Tuesday. I thought I would end with a couple of two quotes from Robyn from the end of the paper. So one is, you'll hear Robyn, for those of you who knew Robyn, you'll hear Robyn in this. When I was at the Los Angeles Renaissance Fair last summer, I overheard a young woman complain that it was horribly unfair that she had been rejected by the psychology department at the University of California, Santa Barbara, on the basis of mere numbers. This is what Julie was talking about. You just look at people's performance and add them up and do that without even an interview. How can they possibly tell what I'm like? The answer is that they can't, nor could they with an interview. And then the last paragraph in this paper, so this paragraph shows that very simple models do as well as elaborate clinical judgment, meaning that people who are doing these elaborate judgments ought to be modest about their achievements and ought to put their time in creating human relationships rather than pretending to do things they can't. So I said, no matter how much we would like to see this or that aspect of one or another of the studies reviewed in this article changed, no matter how psychologically uncompelling or distasteful we find the results to be, no matter how ethically uncomfortable we may feel at reducing people to mere numbers, the fact remains that our clients are people who deserve to be treated in the best manner possible. If that means that selection, diagnosis, and prognosis should be based on nothing more than the addition of a few numbers representing values on important attributes, so be it. To do otherwise is cheating the people we serve. So as I was doing this, so we had in kind of our I was preparing these notes, we had in the underground that there's in fact a rock album that has, with the title of this. And I said, why don't I Google it and see what I find? So here's the album. It's The Robust Beauty of Improper Linear Models in Decision Making by Chris Stamey and one of his colleagues. They're from Yola Tango, who the old timers here know they played Spring Carnival around 1995. And just on a chance, I Googled him, Chris Stamey, and I sent him a note. And at 5:30 and at 6:30, I got an answer on Monday morning. So I told Andy, I said, well, this is a rock musician who gets up early. And she said, or stays up late. So anyways, on a different shift, maybe on a different shift. So actually, when I Googled it, this was the advertisement on Amazon. So this has to be the only rock album. So I think Robyn would have gotten some pleasure on defeating Google's advertising algorithm that a rock album was advertising statistical packages. So, and here's the back of the album, and so it's a real album. So I had this exchange with Chris Stamey, who was actually quite quite taken that Robyn had ever even heard of him, and then was sort of even more taken as we went through that Robyn was a composer, and he was a composer as well. He's worked with somebody who'd studied with Lucas Foss, and actually with the help of Mary Ann, we sent him a copy of Robyn's music. And so I thought I would end with what Christina had to say about the improper, the robust beauty. So he said, well, my collaborator at the record store, that's where the album number come from. My collaborator at the record store, Kirk Ross, worked in a copy shop in Chapel Hill at that time. It was a center of a certain kind of local culture. Someone had made a photocopy of the article and left the original behind. So either Kirk or I discovered it. We thought that our plan of having no plan would fit into his thesis. So he'd read the article. That, as I paraphrase, having a plan, even a deeply flawed one, was a better predictor of business success than no plan at all. And as we had carefully planned our lack of plan, I had made a lot of records by that point and that had elaborate, flawed plans, having none except for those planned except for a start time was quite freeing. And it's still my favorite of my own records, especially the first track, Love. And I quote his thesis often to this day. I'm sorry for your loss. So, thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you to our speakers. There's a reception that follows. Thank you very much.